Hello, and welcome to episode 34 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Jackie Sullivan, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, a member of the Rotman Institute of Philosophy, and an Associate Member of the Brain and Mind Institute at the University of Western Ontario. Jackie works primarily in the areas of philosophy of neuroscience, philosophy of science, and empirically informed philosophy of mind. Jackie is broadly interested in the question of how the mind relates to the brain. While she takes this to be an empirical question, Jackie sees philosophy as having an important role to play in answering it. Part of that role is to understand how neuroscience works. A primary aim of her research is to provide an account of the diverse kinds of practices operative in neuroscience that is rich enough to play a positive role in improving the science and better positioning it for shedding light on the mind-brain relationship. Jackie is chiefly interested in two areas of neuroscience that investigate cognition: cognitive neuroscience and molecular and cellular cognition. There is widespread agreement that explaining cognition and developing successful interventions to treat cognitive disorders requires input from both areas of neuroscience. It is also generally accepted that discovering the mechanisms of cognition is not something that can be achieved in the context of a single research study. Rather, it requires the integration of results arising from many different research studies within and across both areas of neuroscience. By applying a set of conceptual tools for evaluating scientific practices to several case studies, Jackie's research has produced a novel set of findings that bear on the feasibility of integrative practices. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Jackie.
Jackie Sullivan, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this morning?
Fine, thanks. How are you, Nick?
I'm doing very well. And as we had discussed previously, you are currently in Western Ontario. Is that right?
That's correct.
That's great. That's great. And which university?
I'm at Western University, or, well, what is known as University of Western Ontario, but it was rebranded Western University several years back. But because people always called it Western, so they decided to rebrand as Western University.
Cool.
And yeah.
Fair enough. And you've been out there for and you've been out there for a few years now?
Yeah, for about 6 years.
Okay. Very nice. All right. Well, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how you got to Canada, how you found your way over there. But as we do with these things, why don't we go ahead and start back at the beginning? And let me ask, Jackie, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Go Pens.
Go Pens? Is that the nickname for Pittsburgh?
The Pittsburgh Penguins. Yeah, that's the hockey team.
Okay. I thought that was like the name of a Pittsburghian or something like that. Go Pens. Did you follow the hockey of recently?
I actually this year was not following it as closely as I have in previous years.
I understand.
But Pittsburgh sports fans are kind of a unique sort of sports fans. They very much love their Steelers and their Pirates and their Pens. So
yes, that is very good. As I've learned, I'm currently myself been in Pittsburgh for the past couple months, gotten to see what it's like. Very friendly people. Has kind of like a Midwest vibe, but also East Coast. So it's a nice mix of things. Where in Pittsburgh did you grow up? Like which area?
I grew up in the suburbs, in a little borough called Whitehall. I went to Baldwin High School, which is in the suburbs. So the suburbs of Pittsburgh is a very different experience than being in Oakland or Shadyside or Squirrel Hill and the areas surrounding the university. But that area in high school was kind of the cool place to go to study. If you were working on a paper or what have you, you'd always go to Oakland and hang out in Oakland at the university and work. So I spent a lot of time in Oakland when I was in high school. And so, so I grew up in the suburbs, and I didn't really like the suburbs are okay, but they were, like the suburbs everywhere. But I was really keen to leave Pittsburgh to go to college. And I thought that in college, I would major in English literature. I had these 3 great high school teachers when I was in high school in Pittsburgh, Miss Tranquilli, Miss Willig, and Miss Livingston. And they really did a wonderful job teaching me how to write. And I thought, I would go on to study English literature. But it turned out that I got a bit into existentialism at the tail end of high school, as everybody, I think, kind of does. And I started reading a bit of Soren Kierkegaard. And then I went to Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. And there, the first semester, I was taking a course in English literature and a course in history of modern European philosophy. And I was reading Descartes on the one hand and Chaucer on the other. And I just decided that I was far more interested in philosophy than I was in English literature. And so I decided to do the honors track in philosophy at Clark. And so I basically took every philosophy course they had to offer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's take a step back a little bit. No, so this is kind of, so from English lit to philosophy. I'm just curious, like growing up, what did both of your folks do, by the way?
So I should say, so my biological father and my mother aren't married.
Okay.
I mean, actually, and he passed away several years ago, and I never really knew him very well. And he was a lawyer, and my mom, she worked at the University of Pittsburgh and as an administrative assistant in parking and transportation.
Okay.
And my dad, who I grew up knowing as my dad, he had a number of odd jobs, kind of when I was growing up. He had mental illness, and so he had some difficulty with having stable employment.
Understandable.
And, so that was what my folks did. And I mean, that situation at home, I think, it really sort of propelled me towards, I had teachers that were really sort of supportive of my, development, my intellectual development when I was in high school. And so I love my mom and I love my dad, and I was keen to kind of get out of that environment.
Sure.
And that was kind of what led me to Clark. And I think also that experience was, part of what prompted me to be interested in, things like existentialism and philosophy, because growing up and watching, it was not only my dad who had mental illness, but my maternal grandmother also had multiple recurring strokes in her brain. And so she, late in life, had dementia, but she was also treated for mental illness. And I think a big part of that was that she had 5 children, and, the family didn't have a lot of money. And sometimes I think, if I'm being comic about it, that she, it was a nice break when she went to the hospital and wasn't, didn't have to deal with all the demands of family life at home. But anyway, so it was sort of it was kind of an intense environment for me to be in. And I think part of the coping strategy was to sort of, really invest my time in my studies. And then I had faculty members at Clark when I went to Clark, Patrick Durr became my advisor there. He was the one who taught the history of modern class, and he also taught the specialization in philosophy of science. And so he really prompted my interest both in history of modern and in philosophy of science. And in particular, because of my interest kind of in existentialism and then mental illness and the mind and its relationship to the brain and what are the proper ways to treat mental illness, I became interested in philosophy of mind. And so, yeah.
Nice. So that's no, that's great. So, and so you mentioned, maybe this is, I was just curious about the connection, prompting your interest in existentialism as well as familiarity with mental illness. Could you describe that a little bit more?
Well, to some extent, existentialism deals a lot with the nature of the self and feeling, in some cases, alienated by experience and trying to come to terms with that alienation and trying to come to terms with who you are as a person. And so in reading about that, and one of the connections, one of the things that I was looking at when I was in college was a book by a Southern novelist by the name of Walker Percy, who wrote a book called Lost in the Cosmos, the last self-help book. And it actually factored into my senior thesis in college. But the idea was that, being a human being is a difficult predicament. And it comes with a lot of challenges. And one of those very challenges is developing an identity and understanding kind of who you are. And that's fundamental in philosophy. Know thyself. And so that really, that became kind of, what interested me the most. And so it sort of helped me cope and also to understand the suffering that other people were going through. Like in other words, other people in my family that I had.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Cool. So it's interesting to see, I've heard a lot of stories on this podcast and what things we've interested, but it seems to me that so kind of like finding philosophy not only is intellectually stimulating, but it's kind of a way to almost as if self-help in some way, very much like, hey, these writers are speaking to my experience and wrestling with these existential problems, not in just let's not intellectualize. In many ways they are intellectualizing the experience, but you seem to be putting the experience as very, first and foremost almost.
Right. And I think that teachers who saw that I was struggling a bit with what had happened were pushing me in that direction, and it was the right direction for me.
Great.
At that time. Yeah. So.
Great. Okay. So, and I should just ask, so in coming up in English lit and philosophy, what, in terms of like, career prospects or sort of like, defining yourself at the time, maybe even before college, what were you thinking of wanting to do? What, was it philosophy or was it something else? Like what were you interested in?
When I was in college, the plan was to go into philosophy and to be a teacher, in part because teachers had helped me so much, and they were the people whom I aspired to be, right? I wanted to be able to perform a similar function. So I, sorry, now I'm losing my train of thought, but when I finished college, despite the fact that I had been trying to find myself, I found myself slightly lost because I had decided to take a year off between college and graduate school so that I could work on the application that intermediate year. And then what happened was I did end up applying to college or graduate school, but I didn't get in the first time around. And via a series of somewhat unfortunate events, I found myself back in Pittsburgh, living at home with my mom.
How was that experience?
Back in the same environment in which that I was trying to sort of escape from. And there's a major silver lining to that story, which is that brought me back to Pittsburgh, and it brought me to doing temporary work. And then I was working as an administrative assistant in the Department of Internal Audit at Pitt. And I didn't get into graduate school the first time around. And one day, I think it was in the spring of 1997, because I graduated from college in 95. Mm-hmm. I decided that I was going to change my life, right around spring break when people start to go to the gym or, they make New Year's resolutions, sure. Right? So January 1st, 1997, I'm going to change my life. So I go to the library and I'm wanting to use the Philosopher's Index. And at that time, it was on the CD-ROM. It wasn't something that you could just access on the internet. And so someone had left the CD in the CD-ROM and left it unoccupied with all their stuff there. And here I am. I run over to the library thinking I'm going to change my life. And then this idiot has left all their stuff strewn about and the CD in the CD-ROM. And so I wait around and I'm huffing and puffing, waiting for this person to come back because there was only one copy of the CD. And you know what the Philosopher's the Philosopher's Index, right? So, you might not, you're too young to know that it was originally on CD-ROM. But anyway, the person who had left it in the CD-ROM comes waltzing back in, and I yell at him. And it turns out that the person who had done this was Gualtiero Piccinini, who was a graduate student in history and philosophy of science at the time. And I reamed him out. I said, who goes away and does that sort of a thing? Yeah, leaves all their stuff. And, I want to write a paper. I was really wanting to use the CD and, you're ruining my life, man. And it was really funny. He just looked at me and he was kind of smiling and laughing. And I explained kind of, he said, who are you? Because he didn't know who I was. And sure. So I explained who I was. And he said, hey, there's this course being taught. I'm in the history and philosophy of science department. And it sounds like, your interests lie in that direction. There's a course being offered in rhetoric of science taught by Ted McGuire and John Line. Why don't you come to this class? Why don't we see if you can audit this class? And so so a chance kind of meeting in the library with Gualtiero Piccinini kind of, it really changed my life, because at that point I did enroll in the course with Ted and John. They allowed me to enroll as a non-degree. And then the following fall, Marilee Salmon allowed me to enroll in one of her classes, also as a non-degree. And then in the spring of 98, Peter Mockemer allowed me to enroll in a class as a non-degree. And I was able to get recommendation letters from all three professors. And I was eventually accepted into the graduate program. That fall, I was accepted into the graduate program in history and philosophy of science at Pitt. So I had a lot of people, helping me along the way. Had I not ended up back in Pittsburgh, that wouldn't have happened. And one thing I really like about the story is that nowadays people spend a lot of time harping on how negative philosophy is and how people are not supportive of other people, that there's discrimination. And I'm not saying that those things aren't true, but I think it's really important to highlight the fact that there are people that are willing to help you. And, and when you're struggling to do what's necessary to help you get through. And that's what I found, in the graduate community in HPS. And yeah, so
that's a really great story. I'm so happy, and it's a really, you're right. I think that's in times when there is a lot of talk, especially calling out the negativity. It's great to see that there are some good acts that are being performed, people looking out for one another, and he's kind of falling into the field that's great. I mean, of course, you've had this, I imagine had a very strong background in philosophy, and it worked out. How did you, so in connecting with those first few courses that you took, had you done philosophy of science previously at Clark, or?
I had taken one philosophy of science course, and I should explain that when I was at Clark, actually, they have a really strong psychology department, and it was actually the only American university where Sigmund Freud gave his 6 lectures on psychoanalysis, and so there's a big statue of Freud in the center of the college. But I was interested I did take some psychology classes when I was at Clark. And I had a friend who was, after we graduated, my friend Pam went to Rutgers and was working with Alan Leslie on theory of mind and autism. Mm-hmm. And so I visited her while I was, during this intermediate period when I wasn't in graduate school and I was working. And I sat in on some of the lectures, and I got to see the experiments that she was running and some of her colleagues were running. And I became really interested in folk psychology and theory of mind. And so, my background was that I was reading, the work of Fodor and Stephen Stitch, but I hadn't been trained in that as an undergraduate. So a lot of what I was doing kind of in between starting graduate school and finishing college was kind of getting up to speed on what the current developments were. But, the best way to kind of really do that would be to take classes, which was something that I was a bit insecure and afraid to kind of just march into the HPS department myself and say, hey, will you let me into your classes? It really took this chance encounter, to kind of, be the impetus for me to get the nerve up to do it. So, yeah. So.
That's great. Do you have a favorite HPS class that you took?
I don't want to offend anybody. I would say that
one that you particularly liked, maybe not the best over others.
Yeah. No. I liked all the classes I took, but in particular, I really liked a course taught by Jim Lennox on Darwin's Origin of Species. Out of that course, I wrote a paper on the use of thought experiments in the Origin to argue for the theory of evolution by natural selection. So it was just a wonderful, historically situated and philosophically interesting course.
Very nice to hear. I've met a lot of the graduate students here, and they love Lennox's courses. As an instructor, he's just phenomenal. So I've heard. So anyone who happens to be visiting or sitting in, I highly recommend a Jim Lennox course.
Yeah, no, he's wonderful. All the faculty are wonderful, but I just, that's the course that really stuck with me.
Okay. So in coming into moving from, so I should say, it sounds like you were doing history, philosophy of mind at Clark, and then, kind of a nice gradual transition into HPS work. But how did you see, I guess, something I've been generally interested in is just the methodology in the philosophy, in the particular approaches, and I guess what did you see as like a distinction between the methods of, let's say, the general philosophy that you've been doing and HPS philosophy or methodology, and what kind of approaches were you interested in taking?
So I would say that the reason that I became interested, particularly in the mind-brain sciences, is because I was taking courses with Peter Mockemer at Pitt, and a lot of them involved research on neuroscience. Like, we were reading books by Cohen and Eichenbaum. We were reading neurophilosophy. And so on the one hand, I was interested in sort of what was going on in standard cognitive science and psychology. But on the other, I kind of thought, look, Patricia Churchland, she's claiming that the mind is the brain, and, psychology and neuroscience are co-evolving. And I'm not in a vantage point. I think that's an interesting idea about, what's happening here. But and how progress is happening in these areas of science, and how our understanding of the mind is being advanced by these sciences. But I'm not in a position where I can really assess the truth or falsity of these claims. I don't know anything about the science itself. And so, in some sense, history and philosophy of science gives you the methods to the conceptual tools to actually investigate the science. But I think what was missing from my training at the time was a firm understanding of the science. And so, yeah, I think that sort of answered your question, but what it
did. The focus on the science, I think, is definitely interesting.
Yeah. And I also think that the questions that, for example, there's a distinction in the field that I work in between neurophilosophy and philosophy of neuroscience, right? So neurophilosophy is really, different people define these things different ways, but it's really kind of empirically informed philosophy of mind. It's philosophy of mind, traditional issues in philosophy of mind informed by neuroscientific findings. So questions about free will and the self, informed by findings from neuroscience. Whereas philosophy of neuroscience is more interested in practice and methodology. How conceptual change happens in these areas of science. What are the assumptions that are grounding experimental approaches? And so if you're interested in the science, history and philosophy of science, I think, is the right place for you to be. And it's not the case that I'm not interested in questions in neurophilosophy, but I think that you want to be able to see how well the science can answer the kinds of philosophical questions or answer to them.
Yeah.
Given what the methods are and what the limitations, what are the pros and cons of the methods that are being used. Anyway, so I don't know if you necessarily know this about me, but I left HPS for 2 years after I got my master's degree in HPS.
Oh yeah, tell me about that. Okay.
And I crossed the street from the Cathedral of Learning and to, I think it's Crawford Hall, and my memory's kind of failing me. But anyway, I crossed the street to the neuroscience department, and I started taking classes in neuroscience. I started taking undergraduate classes because I had no background in neuroscience. Yeah. And I had to prove myself to the chair of the department that I could actually do neuroscientific work. But I started a master's degree in neuroscience within, I guess, a year after I finished my master's thesis in history and philosophy of science.
How was that? Going from not having as much requisite training and background in neuroscience to then taking, as a graduate student, undergrad classes, hanging out with a bunch of pre-med students. What was
it was wonderful, actually. I had never done that kind of science when I was an undergraduate, and I was sitting in these courses. I took a course on learning and memory and the neural basis of learning and memory, and I took another course on synaptic transmission. And it was just a whole different world that was opening up for me that I didn't know existed. And then, honestly, it was the best, probably. I've had so many good experiences, but that was one of the best experiences. The best choices I made was to go and do that second degree, because I wouldn't be able to do the kind of work that I can do now. And I got to meet, the students were great. It was okay to be an undergraduate or be with the undergraduates. At Pitt, no, I know. I just think that at Pitt, the undergraduate students in neuroscience were among the smartest students that I had the pleasure to meet. And then I made friends in the, among the graduate community. I worked, I was fortunate enough to have a professor by the name of Flo Teals agree to take me on in her lab, despite the fact that I had no prior training in running experiments. And I was, and she trained me in vivo electrophysiology experiments. So I was running experiments in rats, inducing long-term potentiation, which is the neural correlate of learning and memory. And I was also the experiments that we ran, the animals were sacrificed and we probed the tissue for protein kinase activity. And during the time that I was a master's student, I was looking specifically at the activity of a protein kinase that had been shown to be involved in both long-term potentiation and long-term depression. So I spent 2 years doing that, and I was taking courses. And I was also, there's Pitt, the graduate HPS program. The students are able to enroll in the Center for the Neural Basis of Cognition training program. And so that was something that I did as well, which wasn't much more coursework over what I was doing for the master's degree in neuroscience anyway. The teachers there, all the instructors were just phenomenal, and I learned a lot. So,
Great. No, that's really wonderful to hear. So in taking these courses and then, having some philosophical interests both in neurophilosophy and philosophy of neuroscience, at the time, what kinds of questions were you curious about, either in your coursework or personally, just about the field? What were you thinking at the time?
So I worked on the purported neurocorrelate of learning and memory. And one of the things that's interesting about the experimental investigation of this phenomenon is that it's been very much informed by classical and operant conditioning approaches to the study of learning and memory. And so, so one of the questions that really was pressing, and a question that was on a lot of people's minds, was how do you take an associative learning mechanism and use that as a basis for accommodating all the vast learning and memory phenomena that human beings are capable of exhibiting, right? And there had been criticisms of operant and classical conditioning historically, that those kinds of associative mechanisms, they weren't the only mechanisms, or associative learning wasn't the be all end all. And a lot of those criticisms, some of them came from ethological approaches to the study of learning and memory. So concerns about, for example, things like insight learning. That there are other kinds of learning that can't be accommodated in an associative framework. And so I became really interested in, okay, so LTP. One of the questions was, how is this going to explain all the different kinds of learning and memory phenomena that you encounter in the world? It seems that it's not going to be able to do that. So how far can it really get us? And then the second question I became interested in was, one thing that you see in the LTP research community is that different investigators have different sort of protocols that they use to induce the phenomenon. And at the time, philosophers were using long-term potentiation as one of the case studies for arguing for reduction in the reduction of psychological phenomena to neuroscientific phenomena. So John Bickel had referred to the kind of work that was going on in the area of neuroscience that I was working in as reductive in practice, and Carl Craver had used it as an example of an integrative research program. And what I was interested in was how do you get integration or reduction when you have such a diversity of ways to study this phenomenon? And given the diversity of ways that are used to study it, even subtle differences in sort of the stimulation paradigms that you use to study the phenomenon or to induce it in the rat brain, could lead to differences downstream. And if you're interested in discovering mechanisms, and then you're interested in integrating results from these different experiments together, because the mechanisms of learning and memory aren't going to be discovered in a single laboratory. Mm-hmm. The idea is that you have results coming from different laboratories that kind of coalesce into a picture. And I started to become very skeptical that these results could be integrated given the nature of the methods. And so that became kind of the focal. Those two things were both in focal points of my dissertation at Pitt.
Very nice. So is this specifically, so did these questions culminate in a dissertation project?
They did, yeah.
Okay.
So my dissertation, there were a couple different parts to it, but one of the questions was, I should say there are a couple different parts. It's been a while, and I've developed the parts into papers. But one of the issues was, how do you, if you want to identify the causes of a given phenomenon like learning and memory, you have to exert control in experimental contexts, and that was something that Ivan Pavlov and Skinner and classical and operant conditioning theorists, sort of argued, right, that you have to be able to exert control, and you want to make certain that there aren't any confounding variables that are disabling you from detecting causal connections. And so, in the experiments in cognitive neurobiology that you encounter, that there is, you're trying to control the phenomena in specific ways. And then there's a worry about, once you exert that control, how you ever get back to the phenomenon that you were interested in the first place. So how do you extrapolate from those experiments that are very highly controlled to these complex phenomena, learning and memory, that you're interested in, and explaining. So that was the issue in the dissertation, that there's this tension, and investigators have a difficult time, with this tension. It's either if you don't control in the laboratory, you're not going to be able to determine what the mechanisms of a phenomenon are, or what the phenomenon even is. But if you try to kind of build the complexity of the phenomenon into the laboratory, you end up unable to say anything because you don't have reliability. But if you go in the direction of trying to impose control, then you lose that ability to extrapolate. So I became really interested in the different kinds of tensions that investigators face when they're trying to run their experiments. And
actually, to clarify, by control, are you just meaning like the limitation of particular variables, like, or how? Yeah, might be a nice example of control?
So the way I defined it in my dissertation was a tension between reliability and external validity.
Okay.
So the idea being that in order to be able to discriminate among competing hypotheses about an effect produced in the laboratory, you have to make certain that you followed an experimental protocol repeatedly. You've tried to eliminate the possibility of there being confounding variables. And in the experiments that I ran, there were a variety of different kinds of things that could potentially go wrong. And so I was really kind of, I was thinking about the investigative process as one where, an experimenter tries to follow an experimental control over multiple instantiations to attain a set of data that ideally discriminates among competing hypotheses about the phenomenon of interest. And it's only going to be capable of doing that discrimination if the processes if the process is reliable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very good. And that's great. So how was the project received?
Well,
yeah.
I guess it's still to be determined. So I defended it, and
nice.
and I and I, I mean, I think my committee, among the committee, there were different views about its merits and failings.
Sure.
But it resulted in a paper it resulted in a number of papers, but one paper I published in 2009, The Multiplicity of Experimental Protocols, is pretty much sort of the gist of the dissertation. So
very nice, very nice. So, from finding your way into the HPS program, what was next in terms of your career, in terms of your life? Did you go on the job market? Did you look into academia? How did things transpire?
Yeah, so I went. I went on the job market the fall of my final year in HPS,
mm-hmm.
and I got a job at the University of Alabama at Birmingham.
Oh, wow.
And, and so that was great, and they had a really great group of philosophers of science there at the time, and I also knew the chair of the neurobiology department, Dave Sweat. He's no longer the chair there. He's now moved to Vanderbilt. But I had a secondary appointment in the neurobiology department as well. And so I was there for 5 years. And during that time, I had one collaboration with a neuroscientist and a graduate student
mm-hmm.
who we did a collaborative project on Alzheimer's disease, on the nature of the self in Alzheimer's disease.
Mm.
So that was a really interesting project. I mean, we were looking at persons with advanced dementia, and my student we together constructed a questionnaire as a means to detect the self in Alzheimer's disease. You would think in Alzheimer's disease, given severe memory loss, that a person's conception of self is lost, but actually persons with Alzheimer's disease are shown to maintain an understanding of self. And so we were trying to kind of detect the nature of that, because it's important for a number of reasons, but one is that caregivers, primary caregivers, need to have adequate information to be able to interact with their loved ones who have Alzheimer's disease. And so one of the outcomes was to kind of, to provide information about maybe the right kind of way to interact with somebody with Alzheimer's disease. They tend to be locked into a time in their lives that's different than the time that the loved one has shared with them.
Yeah.
And so, so there are better, ways to sort of interact with them.
So that kind of answers one of my next questions. So you've mentioned interest in the self, and then self in particular mental disorders or experiences such as Alzheimer's. But I was just going to ask, why care about the self at all? Why structure your investigations or experiments to look at the concept of self? I'm interested. I'm just curious.
Well, I mean, who you are and how people respond to you is such a fundamental part of your existence. And especially in cases, with persons with severe memory loss, mm-hmm. who, have lost some aspect of that. It's the means by which we come to navigate the world, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, isn't it the most, isn't it the most fundamental thing, how others perceive us and how we understand ourselves, for our health. It's funny, I guess maybe I somewhat take it for granted. I don't work on, my current research, independent research, isn't on the self. Mm-hmm. but this collaborative project was, and I just, if it's the case that you can contribute to improving the lives of persons with mental illness by developing tools for researchers and clinicians to better detect it, knowing that, these individuals, they still have preferences, they still have desires. And if you don't treat them as having those sorts of things, then their sense of autonomy is lost, and it actually causes a circumstance where, their health is already compromised, but now they're in a position where they might develop depression. And there are ways to sort of combat those other kinds of problems that come as a consequence of losing of memory loss.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with everything you said. I'm just curious.
I'm sorry. I don't have I'm sorry. Isn't it the most fundamental thing?
You're like, well, it's it's clear you have taking some of it's sort of like assuming, okay, the self is important. Now let's, rather than saying, I don't know, looking at sort of like modal questions of like, what can we know about? What can we know about the self? Is the self of, how can we access the self or something? I was curious of, experimentally, like, how did, what kinds of ways did you assess whether the self, or like, how did you come to understand or claim that particular patients or individuals had a conception of self?
Well, so, it was a collaborative project with a neuropsychiatrist who works with these individuals he sees them on a regular basis at a local facility in Birmingham. And so he was the one who claimed that, he thinks that there are better ways to treat these patients, and that, and there is a literature in Alzheimer's disease research on the nature of the self in Alzheimer's disease and how there are actually aspects of self that are preserved. And so you have Stephen Sabat and Rome Hare have written a lot about the self in Alzheimer's disease and how you understand the nature of the self, and they individuate self 1, self 2, self 3. My student was, she's an undergraduate and she's amazing. She's in med school now at Birmingham, but she thought that the best way to kind of get at the self, given that we often refer to the self as a narrative self, was actually to ask these, to create a questionnaire that engaged these patients and, tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell me about your life. What are your likes and dislikes? And then it progressed to more detailed questions. But yeah, so I would say that, he asked me to come on board on the project. It wasn't something that I initiated. Sure. And so then my role as a philosopher, and, we were co-training Sadvi, our mutual student. It was to sort of give her some philosophical grounding and trying to think about, what is the nature of this concept. And we were really influenced by Sabat and Hare's work on that topic.
So that sounds like a really great project, something very interesting. So your transition from graduate student to your first position at Alabama, how was that?
It was, it was okay, I guess. I guess, yeah. It would have been wonderful to have a cushy postdoc and not be thrown right into teaching. I had a 3-2 teaching load, which was pretty intense. But my colleagues were very nice. And I was able to teach courses that I had taught. One great thing about HPS at Pitt was at least at that time, was the amount of training you got teaching undergraduates. And so I was able to, use a lot of, some of the courses that I taught were actually identical to courses that I had taught at Pitt. So I was teaching all the bioethics courses, or the majority of them. I was teaching philosophy of mind, and I was teaching an epistemology course. And so those were kind of what I would rotate, every year. Those were the courses I would teach. I taught one course with Harold Kincaid. We taught a course on psychopathology, philosophy of psychopathology. So it was, obviously there are different, it was strange. I had been in Pittsburgh for so long at that point, and then suddenly I was in Birmingham, Alabama. Yeah. The culture is very different, but I really, Birmingham occupies a place in my heart. I mean, I really miss a lot of things about it, and I met really great people there and had some really great students, and so it was okay, but you worry about tenure right away. Yeah. So kind of trying to balance all the different demands on one's time. That was a learning experience. But yeah, I guess I got through it.
Great. So I actually don't necessarily ask this question. How would you say you developed as a scholar or as a researcher, from taking on this first appointment? Like, what kinds of things did you learn upon, taking your first job?
Well, so the skill set that you develop as a graduate student is, I think, a lot different than the skill set of being a member of a department where you have specific kinds of responsibilities. You're on certain committees, and you have to balance that kind of work, with the things that you were having to do as a graduate student. Yeah. I had really supportive colleagues at UAB, and so that was a positive thing. I was able to collaborate with neuroscientists, which was really wonderful, and I was involved in some. I met a lot of neuroscientists. I tried to be active in both communities. I gave lectures in this STS program, honor students at UAB. I think that I had to learn. I mean, I think that this profession is, you're always kind of becoming. Like, sometimes I don't feel, this is sort of like the self, right? Like, you feel like you're always in a stage of becoming, and it's not clear when you will have arrived. But I think that every day presents specific kinds of challenges, and and I learned how to kind of be able to do research at the same time that I was trying to do all these other things, which is the demands that are placed on you as a faculty member are far different than demands placed on you when you're a graduate student. Yeah. Or when you're, and I've never had a postdoc, but I would imagine as a postdoc.
Cool. And so, and in the department, you're doing HPS work, you're working in neuroscience. Was this a department, sounds like, what was this department, more of was very friendly to philosophy of science? Was this something, what was it relations, to philosophy of science?
So that's an interesting question, because historically the department had been more oriented towards ethics. And it's not the case that it wasn't still, but there were quite a few philosophers of science there. So Don Ross was there. He did philosophy of economics and kind of neuroeconomics. Harold Kincaid was there, but he does philosophy of the social sciences. Mm-hmm. Eric Ogner, philosophy of economics. Marshall Abrams, philosophy of biology, and myself, who was doing philosophy of cognitive science, neuroscience, and Marshall does some of that as well. So it was a great philosophy of science community, and that's kind of a rare thing, that you're in a department like that where you have that many philosophers of science who are there. Mm-hmm. But then what happened was, and it can happen anywhere, the leadership in the university changed somewhat, and the philosophers of science started to leave. And once that started to happen, it wasn't clear whether or not it was going to be as interesting a place to be. I mean, one great thing about being among other philosophers of science is that you can talk about the kinds of problems that, the kinds of issues that they're interested in with respect to their science, and see if there is any overlap. And it's just you just learn. It's a better. I mean, I'm a pluralist, so I don't have to be among a group of philosophers of science to be able to, feel like I'm developing intellectually. Yeah. But it was just a really unique environment, and I think you don't find many departments like that, where they're not HPS departments, they're philosophy departments, but they have the percentage of philosophers of science is quite large.
That's really,
and that changed now. Yeah.
So and I'm sorry, I haven't learned as much about the Birmingham program. Do they have a graduate program?
No.
Okay.
So it was just an undergraduate program.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
No master's, no PhD.
Right. So do you have maybe during that time there a favorite paper of yours that you published or worked on?
Excuse me. So, I mean, it was probably the paper I was talking about before, which is the multiplicity. Well,
yeah. Well, this built off your dissertation, but maybe, if you want to describe this, multiplicity of experimental protocols, a challenge to reductionist and non-reductionist models of the unity of neuroscience.
Right. So that paper, so the aim of that paper was basically to talk about the fact that, or to argue that, given that you have variations in the protocols used to produce, for example, long-term potentiation or spatial memory, given variations across different laboratories that are investigating this phenomenon, there were challenges to integrating the data from these different experiments, because it was not clear if you use an experimental protocol in one lab and that protocol's varied in another lab. And by protocol, I mean, so for example, to produce long-term potentiation in the rat hippocampus, you need to select stimulation parameters, right? So, for example, you could use a high-frequency stimulation or a theta burst stimulation. So you're delivering a certain number of stimuli. Basically, I guess this should explain this a little better. They're essentially pulses, electrical pulses, but you can deliver them at different frequencies. You can deliver a different number of stimuli. And basically, there are these mutable features of these stimulation protocols that can change from lab to lab. Mm. And when they do change even slightly, and one thing that is, one thing that had been shown in the literature is that different molecules respond differently given differences in the stimulation protocol. And so subtle differences could make a difference to the mechanisms that were operative in the production of a given phenomenon. And what I was doing what I do in that paper is, I'm arguing against John Bickel, who claims that neuroscience is reductive in practice, that it's reducing psychological phenomena to cellular molecular mechanisms. And I say, in order to be able to do this, you would need to understand how these different laboratories that are investigating this phenomenon, how these results fit together. And it's an open question how they fit together. Yeah. And that needs to be resolved before you can make these global claims about reductionism.
Especially in practice, too.
Exactly, right. And neuroscientists themselves struggle with these issues. I mean, given this, and it's interesting, it's part of this whole replicability crisis in psychology, right? I mean, when you look at, the domains of science, and Ioannidis, right, has talked about this, that if in fields where you have lots of flexibility in terms of how you produce your phenomena, replication isn't something that you're after, right? You're not trying to, reproduce somebody else's results. But then when that's true, there's a question of how these different results fit together into some kind of coherent story. And if what we want are reductive explanations, or what we want are integrative mechanistic explanations, which is what Carl Craver advocates, then, how can we, on what ground, what's our basis for arguing that this phenomenon that you're looking at over here using this particular protocol is the same one as the phenomenon you're looking at over here, right? How are you going to integrate the mechanisms when you're not certain that decisions that you've made might have impacted the mechanisms that are productive of that phenomenon? And so I would say that is my favorite paper from my time at UAB. It was, and it essentially tracks I think that's my dissertation.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I would really love to read this. I myself have interest in integration in psychiatric science, just the general sciences in general. So we should, chat about that more sometime.
I'd be keen to do that.
Yeah. But you get, so you're claiming that against Bickel and against the reductive, that in practice it's not necessarily, and even in non-reductive, more like integrationist pictures, things aren't working. So exactly. Is there a positive program to the paper, or is it more like kind of at least first really pointing out, whoa, we need to reflect on this?
Yeah, so I think I get accused a lot about being a skeptic, and with every philosophical contribution, it needs to have a positive proposal. In that particular paper, I don't work out a positive proposal. I basically point in the direction of that this might suggest some kind of pluralism rather than some sort of unity picture of these sciences, right? It might support a pluralistic picture. So maybe unification isn't the right model for thinking about what's going on in these areas of science. Since that time, I think, sort of in part being pro-integration, or if that approach is the correct approach, I think that it basically what I have claimed is that practices like that I was describing seem to be uncoordinated in ways that will facilitate integration. So then there's a question of how do you coordinate practices to facilitate integration? And so that's something that I'm really interested in now. You see a lot of kind of initiatives, and I mean, given that you work in philosophy of psychiatry, there's these recent initiatives. Well, the recent initiative at the National Institutes for Mental Health, the Research Domain Criteria Project, it's related to other projects that have come before it. For example, the cognitive neuroscience to improve cognition, or to improve treatment of cognition in schizophrenia.
Right. The centric group. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, those are examples of cases in which individuals are collaborating in specific kinds of ways to achieve certain kinds of goals that I think are interesting insofar as they tell us something about the nature of the kinds of interactions and practices, both conceptual practices and experimental practices, that might facilitate the kind of integrative picture that has been advocated by certain philosophers of science and scientists themselves.
So I happen to have read a few of your more recent works, and let's see things such as construct stabilization, coordinated pluralism. You have this term coordinated pluralism, which I hadn't seen until I'd read the paper. Could you maybe say a little more of how that might? Is that a version of explanatory pluralism? I guess, what do you mean by coordinated pluralism, and how might it differ from other proposed varieties of pluralism?
Well, so, I mean, one thing that with respect to my work, I tend to say, well, I'm focusing on specific kinds of practices as they're happening in laboratories. So that there's this distinction, and I'm not saying it's hard and fast, between explanation and experimentation, where I think that certain kinds of practices across laboratories that are running experiments could be better coordinated so as to facilitate integrative explanations, right? So the idea there is that you have, for example, and let's just take sort of, you're trying to figure out the mechanisms of spatial memory or working memory, right? And you as an investigator have a specific experimental approach that you use to study working memory or spatial memory. You define those concepts in a specific kind of way, right? And the way that you define them may be connected to how other investigators in the field define them, but you may define it in your own way, given your particular training and background, right? And so that not only might you not all be using the same concept, right, and not recognize it, but then you go into the laboratory and you select a particular experimental approach to produce, detect, and measure that phenomenon in the laboratory. And so when there's variation in the way that the terms are deployed, in the way that these different kinds of phenomena are investigated, and then you want to unify all these results. Like, I think that the practices aren't coordinated for that kind of unification. But if it's the case, these large-scale collaborative projects where investigators are really concerned about, hey, how do we define this term? Is it a valid construct? When we use the specific experimental approach to study it, is it actually measuring that thing, or is it measuring something else? How do we kind of approximate towards these structure-function relationships that we're interested in with respect to the brain, where we can localize a function to a specific area and then identify the mechanisms that give rise to it? And what you see is that people are concerned about standardizing their experimental approaches, but standardization is kind of a first step, right? I mean, that isn't sufficient, but it's, you standardize, and then you try to determine if the phenomenon that you have is stable or not. And then ideally what you'd like to be able to do is triangulate, and, be able to detect the same phenomenon by means of different measures. And so, but I think so part of how I view this, and this goes back to this idea that, like, as an investigator in a single laboratory, you always have there's always tension between the choices that you make about the phenomenon that you're investigating, whether or not you're going to kind of exert control that's going to disable you from being able to extrapolate, right? Or it actually facilitates extrapolation, but you're always making choices in the experimental context. But if different investigators collaborate, in ways that are coordinated to try to achieve a common goal, this is the idea, that they can address those competing demands that are required for knowledge production in science. And so while it's hard for an individual investigator to do that, researchers coming together, and not just from one domain of neuroscience, but from different areas of science, for example, that are interested in mental illness or the cognitive dysfunctions or cognitive dysfunction, right? That is thought to be one feature of mental illness, or at least some mental illnesses. When they come together to kind of figure out what the phenomena are and study them, in an iterative way, they can make progress that they wouldn't be able to make on their own. And I think that, being here at Western and being engaged with scientists here, the sense that you have is that this model of the investigator, the sole investigator publishing, from results coming from a single laboratory, that's kind of fading away. And people are realizing that, to do science, it's a collaborative endeavor, and we need to, kind of recalibrate our expectations to recognize that fact. So that when I say coordinated, what I mean is scientists from different walks of life sitting down, and they have common problems of interest that they're trying to solve. Maybe they're coming from different theoretical, conceptual perspectives, but they are there when experiments are being, they interact to talk about how to design experiments, how to evaluate what's going on in experiments, and then what the next steps are, and who, sort of a division of labor. In a way that, so that's the basic idea. And I have to confess that I'm still trying to get a handle on, by looking at case studies in which this is going on, I'm trying to get a handle on, nature of it. Sabina Leonelli and Rachel Ankeny have talked about scientific repertoires, and that builds on concepts that have come and about collaborative work, from going back all the way to Darden and Moll, looking at interfield theories, right? So there's philosophical work that's speaks to this with respect to other areas of science, and so I'm looking at that, and I'm looking in various directions to try to kind of get a handle on this. But the problem is, I don't think that there's one right model for pushing science forward, right? And so I so.
Are you pluralist about pluralism, kind of almost, or is it?
Am I what?
Really, I was going to say pluralist about being pluralist.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the kind of the default position among people. People who are strong pluralists. Yeah, they're pluralists about being pluralists. About
varieties of science, but even in conceptions of pluralism, you're like, yeah, okay,
right. No, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I need to, I shouldn't make gross generalizations, or I should get, I'm still, I'm on sabbatical right now. And to some extent, I've done a lot of work that I'm trying to, move forward with, my research and kind of do the positive work that maybe I didn't do in my earlier papers. And so, so I'm still, I'm not necessarily a fence sitter, but I think the ideas are still in development.
Great. No. I'm excited to see what develops. So now you're, I guess we can catch up with you're at Western. And how was the transition from, taking the second job from Alabama did you get tenure while at Alabama, or was this?
No, I didn't. I left. I went on the job market before I went up for tenure at UAB. Things started to change at UAB. Quite a few philosophers of science were leaving, and I just decided to see. I didn't have any hope that that my application would be looked at, but I selectively applied to a number of schools. And one of the things that was really attractive about Western was that they have the Brain and Mind Institute here, in addition to having a wonderful philosophy department, but a wonderful group of philosophers of science as well. And so, it's sort of, So I felt very fortunate that I got this job. I sort of feel like there are larger forces at work somehow, but anyway, so the transition to Canada was, it wasn't necessarily the easiest thing. Especially at this stage in life, it's kind of hard to, adjust to a new place and make new friends. And so I found it quite difficult the first year. And I had a couple of graduate students too that I was training, which was really great, but that was something new for me. Yeah. I mean, I'd only trained prior to that point, one undergraduate student. Mm-hmm. And so there were different kinds of demands on my time. And, but I'm a firm believer in the importance of interdisciplinary training and research, and so I wanted, and one of the great things about being here was that it afforded the opportunity for philosophers of science to interact with neuroscientists. I mean, not only neuroscientists, all different kinds of scientists here at Western, but in my case in particular, the psychologists and the neuroscientists, and so my first year, having two graduate students that kind of came on at the very end of my first year, we have a program here at Western where we place graduate students, we associate them with specific labs at the Brain and Mind Institute. And in fact, right now, we recently moved into the same building with the Brain and Mind Institute. So nice. I'm part of the Rotman Institute of Philosophy, which is an institute that's separate from the philosophy department at Western. And so the institute moved into the same building with the Brain and Mind Institute. And so affording the possibility of, closer collaboration. I mean, sometimes even having to walk across, the campus to collaborate with somebody. It could be a deterrent for collaboration. So the thought was that we could be put into this interdisciplinary research building and hopefully, interact. So anyway, my students were put into labs at the Brain and Mind Institute, and that lab work very much kind of influenced their, at least, their dissertation projects. And so, sorry, not to change the subject, but I think that was the training, being able to provide graduate training here that was interdisciplinary. The kind of graduate training that I myself had when I was at Pitt was really important to me, and it was one of the really attractive things about coming here.
That's great. That's really great. And I imagine you've had some good times training these graduate students. I guess, I forget about that in terms of, I haven't trained a graduate student myself, but I imagine it's a pretty great experience to give back and to, I imagine they teach you a lot too.
They do. And in fact, teaching you how to be a decent advisor, I think, at the same time, right? I mean, the bad thing is, I said this to my graduate students, that when they're the first ones that you train, you haven't worked out all the kinks of training yet. So,
right.
but they're, my one student, he is at Stanford now in Russ Poldrak's lab.
Oh, right.
He has a postdoc there, and he's working with Helen Longino, and so I'm very proud of him. And I mean, I don't take any credit for it, but it's just nice to see him doing well. And my other graduate students are coming up with, they're writing their dissertations, but they'll be coming up to defend within the next year or so.
Very nice.
Yeah, no, it is a great feature. About being in this role, that you can help people develop their ideas, and
so
hopefully you're doing good things. Hopefully you're having playing a positive.
So okay, well, so maybe what's something you've learned as being an advisor? Like, if you were to train other advisors or telling other folks, if you want to be a good advisor, this is what I would recommend. This is what I totally missed. What do you think is maybe an important facet about advising students well?
That's a tough one. I don't know if from my own experience, I think it's really important. It's really important to listen and to have an open line of communication and make certain that you're checking in. It's not easy to be a graduate student, and you sometimes forget how difficult it is. And when you're writing a dissertation, it can really, affect your sense of self. And I think it's really important to recognize, this kinds of the kinds of things that a student may be struggling with, and how to develop. I mean, each student might be better with a different kind of strategy, right? So you sort of, the same strategy, it's not a one-size-fits-all model, right? So I think it's really important to listen and be patient, and to try to provide feedback in ways that's very constructive and not destructive, because, you're very fragile. It's difficult to be lost in general, but you're very fragile at various points in your career, and it's not, it's very difficult to write a dissertation, and people, you need to be supportive. And when somebody, if it doesn't turn out the way that you hope, you just have to be gentle about, I think, giving feedback, and be willing to work with the student, and make certain, as I said, there's an open line of communication. I don't know. I guess those are the most things.
No, those are great. Those are a number of wonderful suggestions. I definitely agree with all of them, and the open line of communication, I think, is really important. That's been the most helpful for myself, receiving training. It's nice when there's an ability to communicate clearly and kind of openly with your advisor.
Yeah.
So what's in the future, and kind of maybe looking forward in the next little bit, what are some of your aims, goals in terms of your work, your career? life in general? What's or whatever you want to share? Like, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I guess maybe you start with the smaller questions. I mean, one thing that I'm trying to do right now is to kind of synthesize the work that I've done into a book, but with this the idea that about how do we coordinate practices to achieve certain kinds of goals in science, right? If the goals are integrative or what have you. So that's one thing that I'm working on now. I also have a project looking at conceptual change in science, in particular in psychology and neuroscience, that using an ontology to kind of track conceptual change. So that's one thing. That's a collaborative project, and I've sort of put that on the back burner for the moment because I'm kind of working on the manuscript. So I think in the future, I mean, I would say that a lot of the examples that I'm looking at for collaborative work is work in mental health research, in particular looking at psychological and behavioral functions that are dysfunctional in mental illness. And I think that I'm just kind of in a transitional period. I should say that I never really had a break after graduate school.
Yeah.
So I had one job and then another job, and so I'm thinking about I'm kind of thinking about what I want to do in the future. But I think one of the things that I'd like to do is actually have a positive impact on mental health research or mental health in the local community. And so that's one of the things that I'm kind of looking into, and so but I intend to stay. I just got tenure last year.
Oh, congratulations!
Thank you. So I'm hoping that that I'll my plan is to kind of stay here and continue the research that I started really in my dissertation, and I can say I'm still figuring out which directions in particular it's going in, but really kind of trying to get a handle on this notion of coordination.
Great. And so you had mentioned something about maybe having some sort of positive impact in doing work in philosophy of psychiatry, philosophy of neuroscience related to
mental
illness. How do you think that might transpire? I mean,
there are neuroscientists here who that work on psychiatric illness, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, who've been amenable to having philosophers work with them, and they actually have clinical practices as well. The thought would be to be involved. I mean, traditionally, I've been involved with kind of learning and memory laboratories, and I think that I want to branch out, and I not only want to be involved maybe with learning and memory laboratories here at Western, but also laboratories that are looking at psychiatric phenomena. And so, I mean, how that can impact the local community, I need to discuss how I could possibly do that. But I also have friends who are social workers who work with the homeless population here in London, and so there are various avenues where I could do voluntary work.
Cool. Okay.
So that's one of the thoughts. And then, I think then how that will influence my work is an open question. Yeah. But I'd like to have a positive impact. I mean, I wanted, as an instructor, as a teacher, you can have a positive impact on your students. We're supposed to train them to think critically and, and be good philosophers. But I think it would be nice to have an impact on the community as well, in a different kind of way. And so the question is, finding a way to do that, and I don't know what the outcome will be, but
sure. Okay, great. So why don't we conclude? We've been chatting for a little bit with a question that I've asked many of the guests, which is, what do you see as the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
That's a tough one, and I meant to refresh my memory about how other people had answered this question in the past. I think that it's important for philosophers of science to, and you see this increasingly, this collaboration with scientists. I think that's important. I mean, one of the challenges, it would be nice if everybody respected what philosophers of science do. I sometimes feel as though in sort of mainstream philosophy, there's a people think, oh, well, there's real philosophy, there's mainstream analytic philosophy, there are the historical traditions, and then there are the philosophers of science. And I think sometimes we get a bad rap in philosophy, and also sometimes scientists might perceive us as, busybodies who really don't need to be buzzing around. And I think it's a struggle to figure out what it is that we're really contributing. How are we, if our aim is to help and improve the science, how do we go about doing that in the most effective way possible? How do we function to promote interdisciplinary collaborations if we're people who believe that those collaborations are fundamental for knowledge production? So I would say that, I don't know if those are maybe sound more like some of my some partially sound like gripes and partially like challenges, but yeah.
No. And well, getting clear on what we contribute, I think, is always good. I've had other guests who have been very much, resistant to I don't need to justify my, or I would prefer not to justify, how this is, what I'm doing is philosophy or not.
Yeah. But, I feel that way as well. I mean, I kind of, I'm always surprised by the disdain other philosophers have towards philosophy of science, because I don't have that same disdain towards other domains of philosophy. Mm-hmm. This happens to be the domain in which I feel that I can do the kind of work I'm interested in. Mm-hmm. But I certainly value other approaches, so I just, and I don't feel like I have to justify myself to other people. It would just be nice if there was some kind of mutual respect, and but you can't force other people to change their opinions, and
I mean, is there anything, you had mentioned housing them in the same building, and at Pitt, it's funny that, I'm not sure if the philosophy department is in the same. I think the Center for Philosophy of Science is on the 8th floor. And I think the philosophy department, at least their administrative offices, are similar. And I've noticed a connection between the two departments. At least for professors sitting in and, I don't know, is there anything that could maybe facilitate the connection between more general philosophers and philosophers of science?
I think it really is one of these things that requires a grassroots effort. And, in a lot of the collaborative work that I've been involved in, it's been grassroots. A scientist will approach me, or, or I'll approach a scientist. And if the drive or desire isn't there, then I think it's going to be on both parties, and I think it's going to be hard. But I do think that you find people, I don't want to make a gross generalization, and I apologize if it sounded like I was making one. I think that you do find people who are amenable to that, and that things are changing over time, right, to some extent. But and it's not the same everywhere, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you, Jackie. I really appreciate your thoughts on this, and thank you so much for the chat. It was great to get to know you and find out about your work. And is there anything else you would like to mention before we go? Discussions about, I don't know, upcoming project, graduate training, anything?
I know. I just want to say how wonderful I think it is that you're doing this, and I feel like somebody should interview you so we learn more about you. I mean, it's been so nice because I've got to learn things about you through, but I think, it's just really wonderful what you're doing, and thanks. I mean, I don't know what I've done to warrant being invited to be on the show, but it's been a really enjoyable experience. If only that I got to talk to you and meet you, and I mean, if it has no other positive, well, whatever. I mean, if nobody ever, it doesn't matter.
That's really thoughtful. I appreciate the gratitude, and like I said, one of the joys of doing this is actually just getting to talk with folks like yourself. So it's a lot of fun, and if anything, if the listeners like it, good, that's great. If not, that's okay too. All right, well. Enjoy your time. Enjoy the rest of the day. So you have tenure throughout the rest of the year, I take it?
Yeah, my sabbatical.
Not tenure.
Yeah. I was going to say, what I sure
you have tenure for the rest of your life. And,
hey, you never know now.
Barring some odd something. But,
it ends in July, but I'm hoping to push it to September when courses start.
Great. All right.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Good luck and enjoy your time in Pittsburgh. That's one. I'm so happy that you're there, and there's so many. Yeah. I'm a big fan of Pittsburgh. So.
All right, Jackie. Well, it was a pleasure talking with you. Enjoy the rest of the day. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Thank you. Bye bye.